So, moving on to today's session, our speaker today is Kevin McNish. Kevin is Head of Ethics and Sustainability at Sopra Steria Next, where he leads projects in ethics and sustainability, risk mitigation and development with both private and public sectors. He's also published over 50 academic articles, chapters and books on ethics and technology, including The Ethics of Surveillance in Times of Emergency, and he's also currently working on a new book, AI and Democracy. Before we get started, I just quickly wanted to reiterate that this is a one-way webinar, so no one can see you or hear you. So please do feel free to eat your lunch without the fear that we can see you. And finally, if you do have anything you'd like to ask throughout the session, please do add it to the Slido at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll pop back at the end and we can go through the questions. So handing over to you, Kevin.
Great, thanks a lot, Lauren, and hello everyone. Good afternoon. I'm just going to close that and move down here. So as Lauren said, my name is Kevin McNish, former academic, hence the publications, and I've been working with Sopra Steria for about 3.5 years now in the consulting business around ethics and sustainability. So the purpose of this talk is to discuss embedding ethics in organizations. How should you do it, why should you do it, and what's the impact on trust that will lead to. But before we get going, I'd like to just start with a quick temperature check. And if you could just click on this, it's a separate Slido to the chat window, but if you just click on this and fill in a poll as to how confident you are about recognizing and responding to digital ethics challenges. That would be really helpful and really interesting. And then run the same at the end just to see if the content of the talk has made any difference to your thoughts about the subject. So I want to start out with what I've called here tentatively a rogues gallery. I suspect as we look at these three people, most of you will have come across Paula Venables, CEO of the Post Office during the Horizon IT scandal, and of course has been very much in the news since January of this year, talking about the issue with Horizon IT. In the middle, we have Martin Winterkorn, CEO of Volkswagen back in 2014, 2015, when the Dieselgate scandal happened. And then the person I think will be least known to anybody on this session will be Jacobus Lens, Head of State Inspectorate of Population Registers in the Netherlands. As you can probably guess from the photo, this was in the 1940s during Nazi-occupied Netherlands period. And Lens was responsible for creating a tamper-proof ID card that managed to identify Jews remarkably effectively, leading to a very high number of Dutch Jews being taken to concentration camps. Now, of these three people, I don't think, from what we can see of any of them, that they were intrinsically evil people. Lens was not a Nazi. We don't know that Winterkorn had a particular desire to destroy the planet. And Venables is not somebody who seems to have set out in order to destroy people's lives. But nonetheless, that seems to have been what has happened in each of those cases. So the point is that none of these three people, as far as we know, set out to be unethical. And yet that was the consequences of their actions. And I would like to suggest that one of the main reasons for that, and we've seen this particularly recently with Venables in the inquiry about the Horizon IT scandal, has been for failing to ask the right questions and failing to think in the right way about the ethical challenges. Now, this isn't just historical either. I think there are ethical challenges coming up around technology all the time. This one from a couple of weeks ago, that Adobe was called out for violating its own AI ethics policies. And what Adobe had done was said to users, if you want to create photographs using our new generative AI, you can do that in the style of Ansel Adams, the famous American photographer. To which Ansel Adams' estate, as you can see here, responded very vigorously saying, no, you shouldn't be able to do that. That is Ansel Adams' own IP, or the estate's IP. If you're creating things in his style, then you are taking and using his IP without permission. And this goes explicitly against Adobe's own AI ethics policies. And then they wrote an open letter to Adobe saying the quote, which you can see here. So even though they have ethics policies in place, it seems like Adobe and arguably others are not following those ethics policies. And one of the key issues behind this, why it is so important, is that customer trust is majorly at risk, and that will have a huge impact on the efficacy and the success of businesses. So as you can see here, 92% of employees, according to recent research by Cisco, say that their organization needs to do more to reassure customers about how their data is being used in technology. And that coheres with our own research in Sopra Steria, where we found that 75% of the public expects organizations to do more than meet the legal obligations for data protection. So many companies will think, well, GDPR is quite stringent, and it is, but the public says that that's the floor level, that's the minimum that you should be doing. We expect you to be doing more, treating our data with dignity and respect, as well as just following the law with it. And of course, we have more concerns around data and technology coming all the time. I can't imagine anybody on this call is unaware of the revolution that we're at the front end of around generative AI, but we carried out some research last summer as to what the public felt about generative AI and where they saw the risks. And you can see here that around 50% felt that it wouldn't be fully understood by anybody, so a lack of transparency, a risk to individual privacy, and a risk of job loss, and well, a fairly major risk of job loss. But also these more existential problems, risk to the future development of society and the safety of humankind. I think those are really indicative of some of the hype that's been going on around AI. I don't think that's true with LLMs. However, there are concerns around bias within society and a high environmental cost as well. And in fact, we're now seeing statistics that the technology sector is responsible for a larger carbon footprint than aviation. And these scandals I've been talking about, these challenges, these problems are coming up all of the time. So, we go back 4 years to the A-level scandal, in which people's A-level grades were being determined in part by where they lived and what school they attended. Not just in the UK, in the Netherlands as well. There was a social care scandal, which turned out to be, again, using a biased algorithm, and you don't need to speak Dutch in order to see the reference to institutional racism here. We've seen deep fakes around President Obama and others being used to say things that they never said in ways that, to the human eye at any rate, are indistinguishable from the actual fact. And with such a major election year going on at the moment, not just in the UK, but around the world, we're likely to see more of these in the coming months. I mentioned job losses just now. Last year, we had BT announcing that it was going to shed 10,000 jobs because of AI. I think IBM said something similar at the time as well. Whether that actually is AI replacing people or whether it is using AI as an excuse to replace people, I don't know. But the fact is that it is clearly the correlation is there between AI and job losses, and that's leading to concerns as well. The problem of transparency was the highest point on the survey when we asked people about their fears. AI, particularly large language models, is something of a black box. We give the questions to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever we're using, we get the output. Nobody really knows exactly why these large language models are coming out with the responses that they are. So it makes it very difficult to have control over them and what they're doing. Facial recognition is something which has been in the news a lot, and probably so for the last 15 years at least. But last year, the National Physical Laboratories in the UK said that facial recognition was now good enough, unbiased enough, that it could be used reliably in public. And almost overnight, several police forces said that they would be using it. And I think there's an open question as to what the public appetite is for facial recognition. And this is a discussion which is yet really to happen, I think. Social media, we're very aware of the manipulation that has gone on with social media. There are documentaries like The Social Dilemma that came out about 3 years ago now, I think. and questions about how social media affect people's news feeds, what you get to see, what you don't get to see, and the fact that large numbers of people now get their news primarily through social media rather than through traditional news platforms. And then finally, another deep fake. This was, well, actually, this isn't even a deep fake. This was a generative AI from last year, a photograph seemingly made in the 1920s. In fact, this was made last year, but nonetheless, it won a photography competition until the artist who presented it said, no, I created this using generative AI. So all sorts of questions there about how AI should interact, what the creative limits are with AI, and so on, as to its recognizability and the challenge that it brings with society. So all of these bring with them all sorts of ethical questions and challenges. And there's a massive cost about getting this wrong. So the Edelman Trust Barometer, which looks at how the public around the world trust companies, trust governments, trust charities, and journalism, has found that 45% of consumers say they would never trust a brand again after it displayed unethical behavior or was involved in some sort of a scandal. So almost half of consumers say that they would drop out of their engagement with an organization after it had been involved in unethical behavior. And I will come to VW again later to look at the cost that the Dieselgate emission scandal has had on VW. So where I want to go over the next 20 minutes is to talk about the challenge that we're facing in a little bit more depth, the benefit from addressing ethical considerations around technology, and the risk that will happen if we don't address those, before moving on to the solution, the how and the why we should really be embedding ethics in organizations, before coming out with a summary. And then I think there will be 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if we start out with the challenge, a lot of people recognize that getting technology right from an ethical perspective, from a responsibility perspective, is and should be a management priority. 84% of respondents have said that companies should see responsible technology as a top management priority. However, only 56% say that their organizations actually do treat responsible tech as a top management priority. And concerningly, only 19% of respondents have said that their company has a fully mature responsible technology program. Now, there are two big implications for that. The first one is, as I said at the bottom, the average time it takes to mature a responsible tech program is 3 years. So in order to get it, not only the policies in place, but to get it into the culture, into the psyche of an organization, so it is actually being practiced, takes time. It's not something you can introduce overnight and see it happen. The other upshot of this is that if only 19% have a fully mature responsible tech program, that means 81% that do have some, this is of the number that have any sort of responsible program. 81% say they have no clear breakdown of responsible tech principles. So that is the majority of organizations that do have some sort of responsible tech program, but one that is not mature, essentially have a list of principles. And those could be principles that have come from, I don't know, the OECD, the AI Act. There are numerous tech ethics principles out there that you can use. But in most cases, the vast majority, 4 out of 5 cases, they don't go beyond those principles to create easy to follow requirements for developers in technology. So they might say, we believe our technology should be transparent, privacy preserving, respect autonomy, robust, etc. But they don't say how this should happen. And one of the challenges that Stephen Vossloh from UNICEF has pointed out in this quote is that if you don't have that breakdown, then product managers, software developers, and others won't know where they stand. They won't know if there is a competing conflict between profit and following responsible technology principles. Which one should take priority? How should they focus at a particular moment? And one of the challenges I found, both in academia and as a professional consultant over the years is the challenge that a lot of people have in even recognizing that they're facing an ethical issue. And so if these ethical issues are not broken down into easy to follow, clear guidelines, then many people won't even know that they're facing an ethical problem. So that's the challenge that we're facing. What's the benefit of addressing ethics properly and actually getting responsible tech in place? Well, there are a couple of reports that have come out in the last few years, one from Deloitte and one from Boston Consulting Group, that look at the impact that companies who have prioritized responsible technology have seen. So 89% of those companies that have invested in responsible technology say they have seen a better return on investment because of that. And particularly when it comes to things like investment in training and investment in culture around responsible technology. 50% say they have seen better data, better products, and better services for their customers because of engaging with responsible technology. Nearly as many, 48%, say that their brand has now got a clear differentiator. They stand out against their competition because their tech is different, their tech is clearly ethical by design. And 43%, as you can see here, say they have experienced accelerated innovation. And I'll come back to that as we go. But I like this one quote from Vipin Gopal from Eli Lilly, who makes the point very clearly when we're thinking about better products, better data, better services. And he says, it's hard to make the argument that a biased and unfair algorithm would power better innovation compared with an unbiased and fair algorithm. And we can look at all sorts of examples of this. One of the most famous is probably the so-called racist soap dispenser, which if you haven't come across, you can just type that phrase into YouTube or into TikTok. And in TikTok, I know it's been viewed well over 1 million times, of a soap dispenser, contactless soap dispenser. White person puts their hand underneath it and it dispenses soap into their hand. Black person puts their hand underneath it, nothing comes out of the soap dispenser. The reason for this is the soap dispenser was working with photosensitive receptors that take the light that reflects off the hand, and people with darker skin reflect less light, and therefore the system wasn't recognizing them and no soap was dispensed. It's a really trivial problem to have fixed. All they needed was a greater diversity of people in the development team, in the testing team, before it went out to market. But they didn't. And they end up with a system which is obviously not deliberately racist, but that was the upshot of what it was doing. And that led to huge problems for the company that developed that particular product. And what we've also seen is that companies that invest in ethics governance, and particularly if they prioritize scaling ethics governance over scaling the technology, so they make sure that the development of the technology is in pace with the governance and doesn't outpace the governance, see 30% fewer tech failures. And the tech failures which they do experience tend to be less severe and they're caught earlier because they have the governance process in place. So it is far less likely that their technology is going to go to market only to find some of those problems occurring. Or even if it doesn't go to market, that it gets further down the line before a problem is recognized, and then it costs so much more in order to fix it. Far better to identify the problems early and resolve them as early as you can. So the risk of not dealing with this was from a piece of academic research which came out a couple of months ago, looking at reports of ethical challenge in this particular case, in the development of artificial intelligence and large language models. And you can see here there's a lot of focus at the beginning. How do we get our data? How do we model our data? And then what do we do at the end with that data? And that makes a lot of sense. But what I'd like to also point out in this is that there are reports of ethical challenges throughout the value chain, throughout the development process. Ethics isn't a one-time thing, which you produce requirements at the beginning and then maybe do an ethics check at the end. Throughout the process, there are different ethical issues which arise, different ethical things which need to be thought about. It's not as simple as just putting in place those early requirements and saying, we want our technology to be transparent, therefore it will be transparent. Secondly, there's an increasing problem with employee loyalty. So 87% of Gen Z say that they would leave company X and join company Y if company Y's values aligned more closely with that particular individual's beliefs. So value is becoming considerably more important to people as to where they go, what companies they work with, and how they function. And they will move between companies based on those values. And where that then leads to this 16-to-1 return on investment statistic, the Great Place to Work developed, and this is pre-pandemic, is that when somebody leaves your organization, it costs you 120% of that person's costs in order to bring a new person on board. And that's an average, because it takes time to find that person, hire them, onboard them. And on average, it takes up to 6 months to get them up to speed until they're actually bringing in as much money as you have spent on them. So it takes considerable amount of time. So if you reduce employee churn, you are going to be benefiting in terms of profitability and stability. And of course, it means you also keep the expertise that you have from those employees. So thinking about company values and the impact that has on employees is significant. So the reason why companies are not addressing technology, responsible technology at the moment, and just in case you're watching this and thinking, oh my goodness, we're not, and we're alone in this, a lot of people aren't. And so the question as to why that 80% have just stopped with those high level principles. The reasons that they give in surveys turn out to be a lack of expertise and talent, a lack of training and knowledge among their staff, a lack of prioritization or a lack of funding from senior levels, and a lack of awareness about different initiatives and what they can do. And again, these are all sort of 42 to 54%. We're talking roughly 50% of organizations are experiencing these. So these are all common problems which are out there. So what do we see in Sopra Steria as a solution? So I'd like to talk through in the last few minutes of this talk about digital ethics strategies. So a digital ethics strategy is similar if you're familiar with an IT strategy. The goal behind it is to tie together a company's vision, values, and business plan to its use of technology and the surrounding culture within that organization, so that those values are no longer just some sort of aspiration at the top, but something which is reflected throughout the organization. And in my job, I obviously look through a lot of annual statements on ethics and on ESG and so on. And the number of them that talk there then about their policies on whistleblowing, their policies on human trafficking and slave labor and whatever else, those things are really important and they're great. And it's good that companies are dealing with that. It's so rare that I read about companies saying, and this is how our ethics, our values are being borne out in our use of technology. And yet, if we go back to the beginning of this talk, some of the challenges which I was throwing out there are precisely about the way the technology is being used. So ultimately, what a digital ethics strategy does is it helps to move beyond a focus of ethics being something that is just for people, and says it's about people and technology. It's about the whole organization in that regard. And technology is a part of that organization. So the benefits is it brings an ethics by design approach into your organization. By doing that, it helps to mitigate risk, reduces the likelihood of unethical technology, which can lead to reputational damages and fines. So again, we could think about Horizon IT as an example there. It can accelerate growth because it brings the organization together to go in the same direction as the business plan. And because of that, it helps to achieve the business goals more effectively because everything, again, is pulling in the same direction. It also makes it more efficient because that technology is consistent with the vision, values, and the business plan. And you're not going to find 2, 3, 5 years down the road that there's some ethical problem, which then means you have to take the technology off the market, retrofit all sorts of things into it before putting it back out there. And by doing this, by addressing these challenges earlier on, of course, as I said, with that brand differentiation, it gives you a huge competitive advantage that you go out and say, look, this is how we're addressing this. You can be safe in working with our organization. Now, I said I'd come back to VW, and I wanted to highlight this poor guy, Andrew Bannister. I say poor guy, I assume he had nothing to do with the Dieselgate issue, but the VW sustainability report that he published in 2014, he had this great quote at the beginning. It's simple. Good sustainability is good business. Better sustainability is better business. And of course that makes sense. And the report is full of what VW were doing to help sustainability. But of course, at the same time, we now know that they were cheating on these emissions tests. It looked like they had very low emissions in terms of particulates and carbon. But in actual fact, once the cars were out on the road, they were chucking out huge amounts of pollution, which led to massive fines and reputational damage. So Reuters estimated that by 2020, so within 5 years of the scandal breaking, it had cost VW $34 billion in fines and lost sales through that reputational harm. So it does make a difference. People turned against VW because of that and thought twice about buying VW. So it has had a significant cost on the company. So what then are the elements of a digital strategy, a digital ethics strategy, I'm sorry. Firstly, there's some degree to which this makes sense. You would need to understand a clear statement of what the organization's vision, values, mission, and business plan are. You need to know where you want to go and how you intend to get there. You then need to carry out an audit of all the things that should be involved in that digital ethics strategy. So a very basic level that needs to involve the technology, and I would say all of the technology in an organization, the culture of the organization, levels of trust both internally and externally. How do employees trust the organization? How do consumers trust the organization? How do they see it? Levels of literacy. This is something which the AI Act has brought out really nicely, I think, is the importance of understanding the technology that's being used and understanding the ethical challenges around that. And then what governance is in place in order to help and ensure that the technology that's being used and the systems and the processes in place are all consistent. Once you've got that understanding, the as is, you can then move to the to be. What is your North Star? What is a clear statement about where you want the organization to be and when you want it to get there? And then a roadmap, which should be as detailed as possible, coming out with KPIs, OKRs, things that are ultimately measurable. So you can measure the progress that you're making towards achieving the goals of that ethics strategy and getting to that North Star position. So how would you go about conducting this? Well, firstly, clearly you need some sort of discovery to understand what the as is at the moment, where you are right now and where you need to get to. You need to be bringing in stakeholders to get buy-in, not just to get that diversity of opinion and thought. And those stakeholders ideally shouldn't just be in the organization, but also people that are affected by the organization, consumers and others. Create clear roles, clear chartered, say what the responsibilities are, what the project scope is, and so on, in order to really get a clear view on what the strategy should be. And then ultimately, of course, the key thing is the implementation. There's no point writing a strategy and then just having it sitting on a shelf gathering dust. So clearly work out what is the budget. Obviously, it costs some money to do the discovery and to develop the strategy in the first place. But if you don't then have a budget for implementation, it's something of a futile exercise. So what is the budget for implementation? How are you going to create deliverables? What's the timeline for change? And how's that actually going to happen? And once that kicks in, you then need regular tracking. You need monitoring of how progress is occurring and metrics in order to make sure that you can measure the change and know that you're on track or otherwise. And again, I come back to the statistic that it takes, the average time it takes to mature a responsible tech program is 3 years. So if you don't have one in place, I would encourage you to get one started now. And our experience within Sopra Steria is we are seeing results from this. We've worked with local councils such as Harrow, where we saw a very clear 10% improvement in public trust around Harrow Council's use of data. A very clear bonus and benefit that came out of doing some ethics work with them. We've worked with high street banks to develop their data ethics strategies. Last year, we worked with the Scottish Government around something they call their Ethical Digital Nation, which is essentially how to develop a digital ethics strategy across the whole nation. We've been working with the MOD, with various agencies to review their sustainability strategies. And I think sustainability is very much involved. It's a part of ethics. We often think of ethics simply in terms of the impact on people, but I think we need to also be thinking about the impact on the planet as well. And we've been working with the National Cybersecurity Centre as well about how to look at ethical issues around identity and how that impacts on public policy. So in summary then, I want to just come back to some of these key statistics at the beginning. 80% of organizations have no clear breakdown of their responsible tech principles. So I think they can be out there saying, oh yes, we embrace responsible technology, we're doing this, but the vast majority of them, 4 out of 5, are sticking at just having some principles and then hoping that those principles are followed through. And I think that hope, crossed fingers, is simply not enough. You need to be doing more to actually see that get embedded throughout the organization. If you don't do that, you run into this problem that Vosloo highlights, that developers, managers, and others simply won't know where to turn when they're facing an ethical challenge. They'll be torn between the short-term business interests and the long-term business interests, if you like, short-term profit over a quarter versus long-term sustainability and stability, reputation, and so on that the ethics will bring to the company. And these problems that companies are facing, so if your organization is in this boat, you're not alone. Approximately half of all organizations have a lack of expertise and talent with responsible technology. Approximately half lack training and knowledge. Almost as many are seeing a lack of funding and prioritization and a lack of awareness of solutions. And of course, these are areas that we can help with. This is precisely the area that we work in. So where I'd like to finish then is to say, I sometimes shudder that ethicists are seen as, or can be seen as technology Luddites. I wouldn't be working for a technology company like Sopra Steria if that were the case. I think technology, and particularly AI at the moment, brings significant opportunities. We live in a really exciting time for what can happen right now. But there are also major risks involved in this. And the principal risk is that we rush ahead with the technology without properly thinking through what the impacts are going to be on people. And in the short term, that can lead to kickbacks when scandals do happen. We saw this with genetically modified crops in the 80s, that there was a large backlash in Europe. People got very scared about them and they ended up being banned, and all sorts of problems that could have been solved were not, because of this knee-jerk reaction to GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Ethical tech, as I've been saying through this talk, ethical tech by design, it just makes sense. It boosts profit, it boosts productivity, and it limits risk. Going back to our Jacobus Lentz, Martin Winterkorn, Paula Venables, you don't have to want to be unethical. You don't have to set out to be evil in order to be unethical. And this is one of the key things. I think people sit there and go, well, my intentions are good. I can see what the benefits of this technology are, and that's great. I think the vast majority of us fall into that category. But if you're not asking the right questions, and we saw this quite recently when Paula Venables was in the inquiry facing the House of Commons, if you're not asking the right questions at the right time, then problems arise, and that can have huge, huge impacts on people, on the organization. So the best way to avoid that is by implementing a digital ethics strategy, by tying together everything that your organization believes in and making sure that runs through not just the people, but also the technology. And I think most already have the building blocks in place. Most already have an idea of what their vision, what their values, what their mission statement, what their business plan is. It's quite simple then to move beyond that and to get that strategy in place. But if you're going to do that, remember, it can take up to 3 years, or take an average, sorry, of 3 years to mature. So the sooner you start, the better. So with that, I'd love it if you could go on to this is a different Slido question now. But again, I'd just love to get your feedback on whether you feel any different, whether you're more confident, less confident. Have I managed to terrify you about ethics? Or do you actually think, yeah, I've got more of an idea now as to where we should go organizationally around digital ethics? So if you've got a moment, just go onto that Slido and answer that. And that would be really helpful for us. And I apologize, I think I might have spoken a little bit longer than I had, but I think we now have some time for questions. So Lauren, back to you.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That was great. Yeah, please do add any questions to the Slido at the bottom of your screen and we'll run through them. We've had a question about sharing slides, and yeah, we can send them over to you afterwards. The next question for you, Kevin, is could you please share any examples of KPIs that could be included in a digital ethics strategy?
Oh gosh, that's a really good one, but that's also very broad as to what the thing. So we have our own digital ethics maturity assessment, which we use in Soprasteria, which gives us a very clear marker as to how an organization is doing. So, for example, if you take something like stakeholder engagement, have you identified stakeholders inside and outside an organization? Are you engaging with them? Are you engaging with them regularly? Do you have sort of quarterly or monthly stakeholder board meetings or something like that? And so you can then actually measure what you're doing, and you can say, okay, right now we're at maturity level 1. We've identified our stakeholders, but we don't actually speak to them very much. So what we want to be is, by the time we get to our North Star, we want to be at level 4, where we're having monthly meetings with stakeholders and we are having annual reviews about the whole stakeholder process. So something like that could be an effective KPI that simply said that it gives you an objective measure that you can draw on and see how you are doing, how you're progressing.
Great, thank you. The next question we've had is, so someone's just said, you talk about the need to operationalize ethics principles, but what about companies that don't have any ethics principles?
That's fair. I mean, I think on one level, all companies have ethics principles. They might just not have stated them. So, I mean, we all, we all have some fairly basic ethics standards. We might not even just recognize them as being ethical. We don't murder people, whatever else. Our organizations, yes, they care about profit, but it's not profit at any price, because otherwise then we'd be involved in gun running or something hideously unethical like that. So, we have principles. We want to improve society. We want to benefit society. We want to benefit people, and we want to make profit at the same time. So we have ethical principles that underlie what we're doing. So obviously that's one of those areas where we can help. We can help come in and work out what your ethical principles are in practice. We can talk about what other ethical principles are that are out there. I think the last survey I did was that there was something like 202 sets of AI ethics principles that have been published now globally. So there's no shortage of how people are thinking about these. So getting those, there are plenty of principles out there to draw on. And we can certainly help with that. And yeah, I would love to, because I think that's a really key starting point. But as I said in the talk, the other issue is then moving beyond that to get those ethics properly embedded.
Great, thank you. And the next question, they've said, we all know that we're in a hard market at the moment and a cost of living crisis. Isn't ethics more of a nice to have rather than an essential? Surely the bottom line matters most.
Um, I'm sympathetic to that, obviously. I think that rather, as I just said, our bottom line the bottom line is never purely the bottom line. We all still have those ethical principles that we live by and that we run by. So they are there and they are guiding us, whether we are explicit about it or not. But the other thing I would say is that we're going to come out of this period, whether it's this year, whether it's next year, and please let it be next year if it's not this year. We all want this to end as soon as possible. We are going to get out of this. And presumably you want your organization to get out of this. And then, when it does get out of it, we want to be in the place that we can move forwards effectively. And going back to that statistic about 30% fewer failures when you're addressing ethics throughout your organization, when you're scaling the ethics in track with scaling the technology rather than letting the technology outpace them. There are all sorts of dangers, as I've been saying, that could occur if we get that wrong. And while we may be in a tough time at the moment, this feels like a good time to also be thinking about these principles, to get things in place so that when the market takes off, those things are already there. The governance is in place. The idea as to how to scale is understood and in place. You have this strategy in place so that when the market picks up, we're all ready for it and we're good to go, rather than waiting until that moment. And as I say, then having to worry about retrofitting some of the ethics into place.
Oh, Brill, thank you. I guess that kind of ties into the next question. And they've said that they're starting to scale Gen AI, having established some use cases, but when implementing a digital ethics strategy, slow down what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's a concern I hear a lot from people, that there's this great exciting new thing. We want to go out, we want to experiment with it, we want to see where we can go with it, find out use cases and so on. And yeah, there's a degree to which what I just said, as you say, Lauren, fits with that as well, that we want to scale both together. There is always a risk if the technology outpaces the governance and the boundaries that we put in place. And a good physical example of that, forgive me for maybe an obscure historical example, but the development of cars. I'm old enough to remember the introduction of seat belts in cars and the mandatory wearing of seat belts in cars. So I think seat belts in the back, excuse me, in the UK, seat belts didn't even exist in the back of cars until 1980. And I seem to remember it was in the 1990s that it became mandatory to wear a seatbelt in the front of a car. Um, and if you go back further in time to the 60s, the safety of cars was quite horrendous. Cars were really quite dangerous then. And the safety of cars has been developing more and more. And those restrictions on the safety of cars hasn't slowed down the innovation in the car market. If anything, it's given it direction, it's grown, and it's grown in a good way that now sees considerable more safety and plenty of cars. So it doesn't have to slow things down. And if anything, being unethical, even if you're not intending to be, being unintentionally unethical, that will slow the innovation down. Because as I said with the GMO example, people will have a knee-jerk reaction when there's an ethical challenge, and we're already seeing that with the problem around Gen AI and jobs. People will worry that there will be negative, and then they'll come out with some extreme reaction like, let's just ban it all, as they did with genetically modified organisms. Or it rather than a massive sort of societal thing, it becomes your particular company has done something.
105180.
Your particular company has done something wrong. And then that damages your company, and that gives you a personal setback in the way that VW experienced. And so in both cases, that it's almost like a false economy to say, let's push on the innovation and scale back, or let's hold back on developing the ethics. The two need to be going forwards side by side. And I would stress as well, it's not just a matter of governance. Governance is important, but it needs to be culture as well. You got to have kind of carrot and stick. You need to be protecting people, but also training people and showing them where they need to go and how they need to get there and why this is important.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think we'll have to wrap up there because we're out of time, but I just want to say thank you so much for today's session. It's been great to hear from you.
Thank
And
you.
thank you to everyone for coming along too. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's session. I know we've had some in the chat already, and also we really hope to see you at next month's talk. Thank you,
Great.
everyone.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
a lot.
Driving meaningful impact. Sopra Steria Next.